I'm Terry Thornton. I'm Curator of Education here at the Modern, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you tonight to this very special Tuesday evening's presentation in conjunction with the Modern's soon-to-open Disappearing, California, circa 1970, Bas Jan Ader, Chris Burden, Jack Goldstein, which is curated by the art historian and curator Philipp Kaiser. Our senior curator, Andrea Carnes, had the brilliant idea to expand the voice of this museum by inviting guest curators to conceive exhibitions in the Modern's galleries from their varied perspectives. And Philipp Kaiser was the first invitation extended. Andrea and Philipp have known each other for some time now and have worked with some of the same artists, two of which are Teresa Hubbard and Alexander Birschler, whose exhibition, No Room to Answer, Andrea curated for the Modern in 2009. And I think, knowing many of you out there, you're highly familiar with that and the fact that we were fortunate enough to collect some very valuable pieces by these artists. Philipp has, the appointed curator of the Swiss Pavilion for the 57th Venice Biennale, featured the artist couple Hubbard and Birschler, along with the artist Carol Beauvais, in the pavilion's exhibition, Women of Venice. Having a doctorate from the University of Basel, Philipp began his career in his native Switzerland as the head of contemporary art at the Kunstmuseum Basel. He has gone on to work in some of the most important art institutions of our time. To name a few, he was senior curator of MoCA in Los Angeles, during which time he curated Jack Goldstein retrospective, and later became the director of the Museum of Ludwig in Cologne. Most recently, he has been named Chief Executive Director of Artists and Programs at the Marian Goodman Galleries. But he began this project as an independent curator with clear ideas about a very heavy material. Having had a sneak peek of the exhibition, I can tell you that this is the type of show that you will want to and will need to revisit over and over through its summer run. As I told Philipp, it is as beautiful as it is smart, and it is. He has organized a brilliant presentation of films, photographs, relics, sculptures, and other materials that speak to the beauty of ideas and information as means of enduring, challenging, and ultimately representing a charged moment in our history. With tonight serving as something of a preview, Philipp has asked two people as closely connected to the artist and content of Disappearing as you could possibly find. Mary Andersen Ader and Helene Winer were there and deeply immersed in what unfolded, which will come to light in tonight's conversation. I will just note, before turning this over to Philipp, that Mary Andersen Ader, an artist and longtime educator, brings to tonight's presentation her deep and unique perspective as Bas Jan Ader's sometimes collaborator, widow, and overseer of the Bas Jan Ader Estate. As director of the Museum of Art at Pomona College in Southern California in the early 1970s, Helene Winer worked closely with each of the artists in this exhibition. Going on to be the director of Artist Space in New York, where she contributed greatly to the 1977 show Pictures, curated by Douglas Crimp and featuring, among other important artists, the work of Jack Goldstein. And finally, co-founding Metro Pictures in 1980, an important commercial gallery in New York where she is today. So as you can see, we are in for something very special tonight. I am truly grateful for each of tonight's guests making time and busy schedules to be here to enlighten us on subjects of Disappearing, California, circa 1970, Bas Jan Ader, Chris Burden, Jack Goldstein. So if you would, please join me with a warm welcome for Philipp Kaiser, Mary Andersen Ader, and Helene Winer.
Well, Terry, thank you so much for the nice introduction. First of all, I'm very excited that both Mary Sue and Helene are here tonight. As you might know, during this week there's also the Venice Biennial opening, and it's a very busy time for the art circus. So I'm grateful that we're here together. Let me say a few words about the exhibition. Unfortunately, you can't see the show before the talk. How everything came together. Terry mentioned that I was working on a Jack Goldstein show, and while I was working on the show, it traveled from LA to New York, to the Jewish Museum. It became clear to me that Jack has always been he was always obsessed with disappearance on multiple levels. And then that was kind of the seed of this idea of disappearance. And I felt, after I got encouraged and invited by the museum here to do a show about California, I felt the early 70s is probably the most important, I think is an extremely underrated time period in general, because conceptualism that got established in the 60s and minimalism and pop art, they transform into something else. And there's this transition period where many things get institutionalized or they get pushed further in a very remarkable way. And I think when you think about Los Angeles, and I talked and worked with many artists over the years, they always say, I ask them, when exactly was LA put on the map? And I would say there are different stories. You can say it was the Ferris Gallery in 1957, but I think that doesn't really count. I think many artists, or there's like a consensus that CalArts opened in 1970. It was this art school that was funded and initiated by Walt Disney, and he imagined this Bauhaus where his animators can cross departments and they can work in different departments, but it turned into a completely different history. So John Baldessari, he was one of the first teachers in his class, where Jack Goldstein went, for example, amongst others, Matt Mulligan, David Sally. All these artists were students of John Baldessari, and at the same time they had the feminist art departments under Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. And so it feels like the show is a case study of early California conceptualism, and what I want to talk about tonight, and I don't want to talk too much about the show, but I want to talk about how the art scene transformed from the 60s into the 70s in Los Angeles. And maybe I just give you like a very brief idea about the exhibition. So Disappearing is first and foremost, it's the title of a piece by Chris Burden that he did in 1971 when he disappeared for 3 days. And he disappeared, only his wife knew it. So I think it's always interesting when you look at the show that there are these dialectics of appearance, disappearance. You have to appear and then you can disappear. It's not the other way around. And you see it obviously with Bas Jan Ader's last tragic work, In Search of the Miraculous. It became like real life, and we want to talk about that too. And I don't mean with this exhibition to overshadow or project real life events into the history, because I think it has much more to do with the birth of conceptualism, conceptual art that tried to get rid of the art object, that was favoring the idea, and was also trying to get rid of the subjectivity of the artist. These are all the processes that made me think about disappearing, the artist that disappears, the work that disappears and vanishes. So that's kind of the common ground of the three artists. Obviously, I could have included some other artists, but I felt it's important to stick to the three artists that were focused the most on this. I don't want to call it a theme, because I think it's more the core of their practice. And so that's what you want to talk about. But maybe what I already mentioned, I mentioned CalArts. There's some other art schools. There was in the 60s, there was the Otis, which is a famous art school. And obviously there's also UC Irvine that started. And Chris Burden, who went to UC Irvine, Jack Goldstein, who went to CalArts. And Otis has a little bit of a different history, but all of the three artists also are kind of products of their time and like the first students of a very radical pedagogy. And so maybe we can talk, we start with Mary Sue, and you were an artist and you studied at Otis College where you met Bas Jan Ader, and maybe you can, and your father was even the president of Otis. So maybe you can talk a little about about the 60s and how, like, about the night before 1970.
The time period of the 60s, I arrived at Otis in 62 after I'd gotten my bachelor's at the University of Arizona. And my father transferred, he was the head of the art department at the University of Arizona, and then transferred over to Otis as the president of Otis. And which was very lucky for me because I got to go to graduate school for $400 a semester. And at any rate, the time period of I would think the 62 to the 70s was a period of the radicalization of probably the world, but of Los Angeles. And it was a very kind of slow process in the beginning, but once it took hold, it was a very, very wild and heavy time. And I think that for me, I was a little bit too old to really participate in a lot of it. As time went by, I was sort of looking at everybody doing things, and the closest I got to revolution was when the feminist movement came along, and I participated in that to some degree. There was also one of the heaviest things of that time period was the Vietnam War, well, the Cuban crisis to begin with, which I spent in a bar waiting for news about whether the bomb was going to drop on the U.S. from Cuba or not, and it was a very trying time. And then came the Vietnam War, which was also a little bit after I graduated from Otis in 65 and began teaching right away in a community college in California. And the time period of whether there was going to be a war to begin with, and then the advent of the war itself was pretty scary to begin with, and very difficult for young men, especially, of course, to decide how they were going to proceed with their lives. And some of us got very involved in the anti-war movement, and that really did color the rest of our lives, particularly at that time. Well, the rest of our life, my life anyway. And I think that really was something that should be incorporated into any of the language of that particular period of time in art, not just in Los Angeles, but everywhere, of course, and because it was everywhere in America anyway. Although in Europe there was a big, large anti-war movement there too. That was something that politicized Bas Jan and me, and we got involved in anti-war walks and any kind of other actions that were available to participate in the Claremont area. We were living in Claremont, California at that time because my work was in San Bernardino. My husband went to graduate school in Claremont Graduate College, which was halfway in between, well, Los Angeles and my work. So, and he was able to go there, and it was good for him to get away from my dad's school, and he was a little bit more independent there, I think. Anyway, the anti-war movement was pretty rife in Claremont, as well as the educational turmoil in the late 60s. That was also part and parcel of the whole anti-this and that movement. And at any rate, that's kind of like something that was really important to us, and I think it was something that gave Bas Jan sort of an immediacy to do what he needed to do, which was, of course, leading up to his final artistic effort, which was part of what he did when he made the sale. He built up his if you follow his work from his graduate show in Claremont through to the last sale, you see there's a direct connection, and it was like a step by step by step by step, and it's really in some ways quite beautiful to see. You see the working of his mind and the progression of his ideas, and I can say now that it's pretty exciting to me to see this show, which has collected together a lot of the pieces that he did in that time period. And you can see also the steps to some degree. Bas Jan I should say that we lived outside of Los Angeles until the 70s, and that made a difference. He wasn't connected so much socially with all the other young artists in Los Angeles, and just a couple of them, and it was different for us than it might have been for other artists of that time period.
Yeah, we'll talk about Claremont, because what Terry mentioned before is Helene. I mean, you mentioned that you showed all the three artists like on the side, but actually Helene showed them for the first time, which was, but maybe before we talk about Claremont, which is maybe an hour from downtown LA, or half an hour depending on traffic. Can be like 1.5 hours. Helene, you worked at LACMA, the LA County Museum, in the mid-60s, right when it opened. Mm-hmm. And then you took over, you went back to England for like a year or two, and then you came back to take over the Pomona Art Gallery. Can you talk a little bit about the shift, before we talk about Claremont and what happened in Pomona? Can you talk a little bit about how you grew up in LA, how you perceived the art scene and all that, and then you moved, and what happened in between the mid-60s and early 70s?
I went to USC, and I was somewhat exposed. I studied art history, and I was somewhat exposed to the LA art scene that existed, but I had no idea that there was such a thing as an art scene after Picasso and Leger in Paris or something. So I started graduate school, and I also got a part-time job at the LA County Museum of Art, and I was studying American art at the time, and I kept gravitating towards things going on at the time and shifted to contemporary art as quickly as I could. So I knew suddenly there was an LA art scene, but it was very, very local. It wasn't fluid as it is now, and I really loved it all. I was a young girl, and there were all of these glamorous young artists, but they were older. It was the Ferris Gallery kind of generation of artists, and they were very specifically LA oriented based, and I had some, as a slightly art historically, leaning person, I had a little doubt about that kind of, oh shucks, cowboy, we don't talk about our work We just do it, And I enjoyed them, and they were quite smart, and I love the work now more than I did then, but I did care about that work. But I left LA after several years at LA County Museum. It's too long a story to say why, but I went to Europe, and I had met a lot of people. I was kind of the girl guide at LA County. So whenever people visited from Europe, and of course they didn't drive, and I was their chauffeur and guide. So I knew quite a number of people. And then I went to Europe with some friends who were doing a film, and ended up in London because of the language, and I got a job at Whitechapel Gallery through some people that I had known through LA County. So if you know Whitechapel Gallery, it's an important exhibition space. It's not a gallery, it's like a Kunsthalle. It doesn't collect art, it shows contemporary art. And it was the era of what you call in your catalog orthodoxy of conceptual art and fluxus art, and those were the artists. And compared to that I knew and met and socialized with and went to bars with and concerts with and things. So compared to the LA group that I had just left, and there was this intense, I saw thousands of pieces of art with typewritten pages pinned to the wall, and they were brilliant and verbal and knowledgeable and intellectual, and I was, from LA, so I was pretty impressed. And that's what I was involved with and believed in, and then for one reason or another, leaving that out, not interesting, I left Whitechapel and returned to Los Angeles and got a job at Pomona College because I knew everybody somehow, the entire conceptual community, and that was of interest to the artists who were teaching in the art department, and that was a bit already of the tradition of the kind of progressive art at Pomona. So I was happy to get the job in, I thought, the middle of absolutely nowhere. And really, I thought, well, nobody's going to know what I do here, and I'd better show quite young artists because they're the only ones who will want to have a show there and feel excited. Versus, I didn't know, several generations of other artists, and Picasso and Man Ray. And I'm not kidding, actually. That's how long ago it was. So I started looking at art and new art, and I felt very determined that there had to be something new happening there. And I just didn't want to do, third generation, second generation conceptual art. It was a little boring. Once the idea had been developed and a lot of work, brilliant work had been done to just continue it. And there were artists that were very smart and doing quite good work, but I just wasn't interested. So I did find eventually, piece by piece, young artists who I was absolutely stunned by. Really brilliant artists, these three artists and several others. And I could not believe my good fortune that there was art that I could get that excited about, just beginning. And I, offered them each a show the minute I walked into their studio. It wasn't like I planned out a long schedule of carefully strategized exhibitions. And it was really an interesting time. And I must say, in thinking about what Mary Sue just said, and that's when I met Mary Sue and Bas Jan Ader, and they were both amazing, and Mary Sue was beautiful, and Bas Jan was very glamorous and European. He was our more sophisticated LA artist that he did, and he did not hold back on referring to that as well. he's kind of educated, you know. So, or in the history and ideas of art. So it was an amazing time, and still I feel the same. And I have to say, while we're all sitting here, that this is a brilliant exhibition. Philip did something curatorially that we would wish curators could do, and they wish they could do, is really think about what the art is and what these artists were talking about and thinking about and what it meant at the time they were doing it. And I can tell you, I thought none of these things at the time. I knew how brilliant they were. I knew how important it was that I considered it the best work that was being done at the time, but I didn't place it in any other way, just like you can't with anything that's happening right around you. And I love this show, and it's thrilling for me to see it because it really does clarify the intensity and the pressure on these artists to make some kind of significant statement that they could live by and with. And I think that relates to the times. And that they wanted, partly because of LA's history of somewhat decorative, somewhat superficial seeming, I don't believe that now, but appearing, surface appearance of art, that they had to really identify themselves as conceptually oriented, but content, full content, very personal, very philosophical. It had to be something more than a statement about what art could be. It was a statement what an artist can be and what their kind of communication could be. And it's something artists, as we were talking about earlier, are facing now with a very difficult period. How to represent, how to continue as an artist and not remove yourself from the realities of your time. And they had a double, triple role to play as individuals, as following up on the ultimate statement of art not needing to be whatever traditionally it's perceived as, and to not repeat anything that was done. So somehow this was, from my point of view, was a driving force, and I don't know, I think they felt very strongly this same pressure that they were going to say something else, something quite new. And I believe they did, and this show is remarkable in the sense that it's quite intense, and the work is very specific to that artist and that time and that place, and what preceded it in the art world. And did you ask me that, or didn't?
No, but Helene makes me very happy. Thank you. No, but I think it's interesting. You as a curator, you have to look back. I wasn't around at that time, so I was born at that time.
I'm sorry.
When you took
think
over
how
the
wise
show.
you would be.
But so when you look back, you create these narratives. But I feel the idea was really generated by the artists themselves, by the works, and I tried to knit that, to knit like an argument through that. And I feel it's also very complex about the three artists because they all showed with you, but they weren't really part of a group. Some of them, I think Chris Burden was obsessed with Bas Jan Ader. He wouldn't admit it, of course. And
he wouldn't have been at the time at the earlier time. Yeah. He wouldn't have known it.
Yeah, but when you look at the work in the exhibition later on...
later, I think so, clearly.
Absolutely, and then Bas Jan Ader was a little dismissive of Burden, and Jack Goldstein, it's very complex. It's like Jack Goldstein and Bas Jan Ader were friends. But before we go into these relationships, I think what's remarkable about the immediacy of your program that you established in Pomona over the 2 years, and then Helene was fired, or being let off, right?
I was fired, yes.
But it wasn't, I mean, it was interesting when you look at the history of Pomona. I mean, it was a college museum, but it was very complex during the year of 73. The Norton Simon Museum and Pasadena Museum of Art closed, and Norton Simon shut down Pomona. I mean, it was kind of the end of a very experimental time. But what you did in these 2 years, the question is also, what do you do, but also, did it get seen? But so many artists, John Baldessari, for example, who taught at CalArts, he would come with the VW and his students from Valencia. CalArts is outside, I don't know how many miles, another hour exactly north of Los Angeles, and he would go and see the shows. So there was this network, and it feels when we look back, it feels very innocent, but you just did what needed to be done. Mm-hmm. And you invited these artists, and they would pass on the show, and it feels like there was this...
Well, I just was finding the best art, as most curators, if you're dealing with very new art, you just find the best art you can to show.
But so, Helene, what do you think has changed? Like, talking about going back to the question, when you were at LACMA and you were younger and you were just an assistant there, but then how did the LA art scene, or would you describe what happened in Pomona, or the artists you encountered and worked with who were the products of all these new universities and colleges? Do you think, now we look back, and I would say, I said in the beginning, the exhibition is a case study of California conceptualism, but do you think there was a shift towards a vernacular language, or was it something new, or did you feel there was...
You mean that these artists were doing?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I thought it was directly, I don't know about vernacular language. It was definitely, it seems sort of provincial to do that, but LA has such a romantic mythology and content in the film world, and glamour and surfers, and just a lot of imagined fantasy images. And this art, in various ways, related to that. It was very visual and very beautiful, and the presence of it was often far more felt than what any conceptual artist would have been doing elsewhere. And Bas Jan in particular played with the tropes and conventions of filmmaking and comedy and tragedy, comic tragedy. And all of the artists were very aware of this, also this preceding group, which is not unimportant by any means, of artists who were called fetish finish group of artists. And there were prior, lots of other artists, but they were quite glamorous and handsome, and were always in their ads for Ferris galleries, standing by their car looking very tan and handsome. And it was a bit of a showbiz kind of element to LA. And of course, these artists would have done anything to, remove themselves from that. But it certainly was saturated their art, and their art thinking about what you're communicating and what people are receiving and seeing, and how much, in their case, it appears, partly to me now through this show even, that their personal intensity, their thinking, their view of themselves as artists and what they could possibly bring to it that would make a difference. And that you can feel, but they had, I think, a local kind of model for methods and means. What is it they say in the hearings, always in the Senate? Not revealing the means and methods of the FBI, So there was a little access to something there that artists elsewhere wouldn't have felt related to or comfortable with. And so I do think something happened that then influenced a lot of art after that time. So they were, to me, really important players in the kind of broadening of art's kind of discourse. Did I answer that one?
That was wonderful. Mary Sue, you were trained as a painter, but you were instrumental for Bas Jan Ader's work from the very beginning. So for those of you who know who've seen, for example, Fall Number 1, the Claremont house. That was their house. It's not there any longer, but you were filming many of his pieces. You were taking photographs, filming. How would you describe, maybe you can talk about the most memorable moment in the collaboration, and how was the collaboration?
It was, I can't say that one piece was more memorable than the others, because each piece to me was really exciting to work with. And I definitely wasn't an equal collaborator in any of the pieces. I was the handmaiden, so to speak.
Not quite.
Did he give directions?
Would he give? Sometimes, yeah. But he trusted my eye and my ability to figure out what he was trying to do.
But you also were in discussion with him all the time about the pieces and the ideas and their development, so I wouldn't sell yourself short.
Thank you.
In this
Okay.
age.
Exactly.
I won't. All right. But at any rate, I thought that, to me, I mean, his work is really exciting, and in spite of the fact that he sailed away and presumably kicked the bucket, I really enjoyed doing the In Search of the Miraculous piece all over Los Angeles, and that was pretty beautiful. We went from dusk till dawn with Bas Jan with a flashlight searching for the miraculous, and I would take pictures. We moved all over Los Angeles area and started on a freeway and ended up on the beach. And you'll see the series of photographs there. They're a little bit darker than they should have been, but otherwise, sorry.
Yeah, maybe we want to talk about that. So that was part In Search of the Miraculous. It was supposed to be in 3 parts, but unfortunately the third part, The Walk in Amsterdam, didn't happen. But the second part, which is maybe the most famous one, and I know I asked Mary Sue this morning, I said, I'm sure many people and art historians have asked you about this, but do you feel okay to talk about that? Because it's remarkable when you see the show there, before he would take off with the sailboat, Bas Jan had a show at the Copley Gallery, and he would show this chorus of these girls from UC Irvine, and the sea shanties are there, and then after that he took off. And there's also a film piece that we included in the presentation that is film footage that you took, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the second part.
Well, okay. That came after we searched for the miraculous in Los Angeles. That was the second part of the Claire Copley Gallery show. That was also considered the first part of a triptych, which was also, of course, a play on words. And the center part was the sail. And in the process of preparing for that, Bas Jan bought a boat and prepared it for sea, tried to make it seaworthy, and to our friends that were experienced, he was an experienced sailor and had made an 11-month crossing from the Atlantic up to Los Angeles in the Pacific on a 35-foot wooden ketch with another man. And they experienced every broken down thing that could happen to a sailboat. At any rate, so I had great confidence in his ability to actually make the sail and arrive at the port. And I was counting on that, of course. But I also was realistic and knew that there was a chance that it wouldn't happen. But that didn't make much difference to me at any point or another. Being realistic wasn't exactly comforting. The middle part was the preparation for the sail, and which was pretty extensive, and he altered the boat so that it was more seaworthy, and altered the rigging, and everything that he could alter, he altered. We drove the boat back from Los Angeles to Cape Cod and stopped in Syracuse on the way, and you'll see some slides of that, or I think it was slides or film of that. And at that point, we bought all of the cans of beans and water, what we would contain the water in, and we set him up with 180 days at least of food and water if he was able to spread it out. At any rate, so we had to tow him by motorboat out from where the harbor that he was situated in the boat. We towed him and the boat out to the sea, so that because there's a lot of nasty shoals in the Cape Cod area, and it would have been taken a lot of time to just try to navigate through that, which he didn't need to spend time on. And so we took him out to the ocean, and he made his final preparations and sailed off, and I photographed him off to the horizon, and the little dot disappeared. And it was, at that time, of course, it was, to me, I was still hopeful, and I was confident to some degree, at least, and I didn't want to think about it at that point. And so I was there with the car and my mother, and my dog, and we drove back from Cape Cod to Los Angeles again, eventually. I was from my point of view, I was very lucky because I taught, and I was able to depend on having to go to work and teaching and communicating about art as my saving grace for not going kind of crazy and being in tears 100% of the day. But I kept hoping that he was going to make it for at least 6 months after, from the time he left to the time that was about Christmas time, New Year's. And then at that point, I went to Holland in August and was waiting there in hopes that he would make his arrival. And then I went back in January during Christmas break. And we went both times to the embassies of all of the coastal states in Europe, and informed them that Bas Jan was in the water, and would they tell everybody who was in the water also, or above it, that he was there somewhere and that they could take watch out for him. And Interpol was at one point was interested in the whole thing, and we got reports from a couple of the embassies, and nobody had seen anything or whatever. So the third part ended with his boat being found in a fishing area in the Atlantic, southwest of 250 miles southwest of Ireland. And at that point, the boat was taken on a fishing boat, and when they were through fishing, they took it to Spain. And Bas Jan's brother and I went there and in hopes of seeing the boat, but were unable to see the boat. But we got all the information they could give us about what the condition of the boat was, and And we eventually got photographs of that. So, not we didn't, but Pedro Giuliano did that. At any rate, the boat was found. It wasn't, the rigging and the masts were gone, and the back of the cabin was out, and there were still things inside the cabin. And I don't know if you want to go into all this, but inside the cabin were his clothes and cans of food, and I chose a pair of sunglasses as my relic of the time period. And his brother, we went together to look at the boat. I took his sextant. And at any rate, we weren't able to see the boat because it had been stolen from the yard that it was being kept in. And it's totally disappeared, to go on with the idea. And ironically. And it was, it's just been, of course, the tragedy of my life. And at a certain point, I moved on, but then it's like you never do move on. So the third part of the what do you call it?
The trilogy.
You could say that, the trilogy or the triptych didn't ever come to fruit.
It's your life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my life is the triptych, the end of it.
How was that? I mean, Helene, you were in 75 when all this happened, or 76, you were in New York.
I was in New York and I heard about it.
She called me.
How did you hear about it, or did you hear?
Well, a lot of the artists had moved to New York. I moved to New York, and we were in touch with you and other people. I knew it was happening, and I'd gotten some postcards, not from the sea, but I knew that this dangerous, precarious thing, but somehow it never occurred to me anything would go wrong. I don't know why that would be, but then when I heard he was missing, I remember that Jack Goldstein and I remember exactly where we were, and we were saying, I said, I know he did something. He's in Key West, Florida.
Is that Jack who said that, or?
I said that. I just had some feeling like it had to be something else than just drowning at sea, dying at sea. It just didn't seem possible. And occasionally I see some old, tall, thin, Nordic type guy, real tan and swarthy, down in Florida somewhere.
Florida.
It's him. Because it just seemed, that was what I wasn't involved in this. I'd never heard this story in that detail, and it's very a little painful. I would have, had I talked to you in that whole process, I wouldn't have had that reaction I had, but it was still a little fairy tale-ish to me.
It was, and when he talked about, what he wants to do, he talked about his romantic voyage. It was very clear that's how it was framed, and I think that's also the important contribution about this piece. It was about having, like performance art, you would do a voyage, that's a transformation to whatever. Yeah. But I think what's interesting, what Jack Goldstein said many years later, and when you look at all of the three artists, you see that they were obsessed with the theatricality, in a way, of the event. But there were some artists like Chris Burden and Bas Jan Ader who would do what they said. Chris Burden, for example, he was hiding in a locker. It was the locker piece. That was his MFA piece at UC Irvine. He would stay in a locker that was 2 by 2 by 3 feet for 5 days, from 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, and he would leave the locker on Friday at 5 o'clock when the work week was over, and there was a tank with water above his locker, and in the lower there was an empty tank below him, obviously. And Jack Goldstein said about, many years later, he said about Bas Jan Ader, he said, this was such a fantastic piece, but I would have done it, I would have made a flyer or an announcement.
Right, and not done it.
And not even done it.
But there was, but he was it was a much grander scheme of his in a way, tempting fate, having possibly accomplished. I mean, there's a long history of lone sailors striking out, and I was going to ask you, when you see the show, you'll see the boats, the sailboats that are Chris Burden's. Are they the same size?
No, they're larger.
They're larger, I thought so. These are small sailboats. And I saw a replica that was built by an artist in Eindhoven, Holland. I almost fell over. It was just tiny.
Ahmet Ogut, the Turkish artist.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was 12 feet, 6 inches.
But there was a lot of his work, and I think you touched on it in your text, and the show kind of communicates that a lot of his work that led up to, not to mention the poem by his father about sailing and the location of their younger years. He has quite a story. And when you were talking about your involvement with the Vietnam War, I hadn't thought about that. I didn't know you quite. I mean, the war was still going on, but I think part of that time. But I didn't know you when we were all marching around and things. And I thought of Bas Jan, I have to say, as part of somehow World War II.
Oh, it was.
Where all these European intellectuals, tens of thousands, came to Los Angeles to work in the film industry and teach at universities, and all the philosophers were there, and their, pictures of them in their tweed coats and sitting under palm trees and stuff. And Bas Jan was a little like that. I thought he was one, the Frankfurt School.
He would also, Goldstein would talk about him as if he was like part of a different generation.
Yeah.
But there were only 3 years in between.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But maybe that's the moment where we should open up the conversation if you have any questions.
Yes.
Sure.
There's one back there.
All right. I personally experienced California and Vietnam and seeing people I knew and people I took care of in Vietnam disappearing. And disappearance is something that's been on my mind. About 10 days ago we were talking about this show, and all of a sudden 3 kind of iconic disappearances came to mind. I'm just going to mention them and ask you if you can comment on whether or not they relate to this period. And one was D.B. Cooper.
Right.
Another one was Eddie and the Cruisers.
I didn't know that.
And another one was Robert Rowe, who was, I would bet you a lot of people don't know who Robert Rowe was. He's dead now, but he was a hard-charging Special Forces colonel in charge of the Special Forces in Vietnam, who got on the wrong side of Creighton Abrams, who objected to the Special Forces carrying out clandestine activities under this colonel that he didn't have control over, and arrested Rowe and kept him incommunicado at the stockade at Long Binh for a month before his wife back home got Times reporters interested enough that they finally found him locked in a solitary confinement in a military
I'm
stockade.
sure that it is somewhat related, those ideas.
I mean, the locker piece I mentioned, for example, Chris, there was this association with the tiger cages that were used in Vietnam. I mean, there was a direct analogy.
I just have one little anecdote that's not as serious as this all could be and what your comments were. But when I got the job at Pomona, I had just come back from England, and I had this big afro, which I thought was sort of fashion, not political.
Like Angela David, right?
Yeah, well, that's the story. She was on the run at that time. I mean, I thought that was all very interesting. I had these little same kind of glasses and stuff. And I drove every day. I got stopped 3 or 4 times by the police while they were looking for Angela Davis. And when I was interviewed for my job, they just wanted to make sure I wasn't involved with any violent politics. It was just because I'm this person who works in art, I do art show. But it really was a very salient set of issues at the time that everyone was nervous, and just to place the time just outside of the disappearing, except about women, which they couldn't disappear because they never appeared as to make that, to make that comparison. And I was the only woman faculty member at Pomona College, the only woman on the faculty, and they had some adjunct people that taught modern dance or something, and really it was terrible. And I was not even qualified fully to be a full professor, or assistant professor. And they asked me to pour tea and do things like that for the faculty tea. For
the ones.
No, for the faculty that I was supposed to sit there and do this thing. But so it was a time a very, very particular time, a transitional moment, and after years of the Vietnam War, and I didn't relate the state of mind of those men, boys at the time, in this show. And you mentioned Women House, which was because there are no women in this show.
But I talk about that in the catalog. I mean, that's a part of the show. It's talking about the disappearance of the white male artists at the time when in California feminism got institutionalized. I mean, that's a part of also of my essay, and I talked to Judy Chicago and these people about the conscious or the dialectics between all this that's happening in the show and the disappearing on so many levels as a subconscious response to what's happening in California. Because as you might know, Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, they start the first feminist art program, or it moves from Fresno to CalArts, and it happens at exactly the same time when also Goldstein was at CalArts, and there are also overlaps between some of the artists, Suzanne Lacey, a little bit.
Yeah, really very little, I have to say.
A little bit later.
And in my mind, I wish I had not paid attention to that particular faction, but been a little more aggressive about locating other women that would have been more associated with that kind of thinking, and there were some at the time. But
Teresa?
I wanted to add one more thing about the question that for Bas Jan, his father was in the underground, in the Dutch underground during World War II, and he was captured eventually and was executed at a certain point after he was captured for, I guess, many months before he was executed. And he wasn't executed because of himself, but because somebody in the local community had done something, killed a Nazi, and so they took my husband's father and a couple of other people out and shot them. Firing thing.
The piece with the trees in the show I didn't know at the time. I showed that at Pomona. I thought it was a very moving, very beautiful piece. He was very specific about talking about doing it. I had no idea about his father's story and the cut down trees and fallen bodies. There were 5 other people shot in the forest, and I was amazed at that. But it had the same power with or without
the story.
The story, very strange about that time. I'm going to have to even think about all of this.
Damn.
Maybe one.
So I have two pragmatic small questions. The first is for you, Mary Sue, and thank you both for being here.
Happily.
My first question is it's about blunders, and you both were young artists at that time. What was it like when you missed the shot? Was there ever a moment where, like in Fall 1, for example, did Bas Jan do multiple takes, or
No.
were there? Was
I
it,
never
was
missed
it
the shot. Not a problem. I was very
And was there, I guess, what was his relationship to the photographic or to the filmic? Once he saw the footage afterwards, was there a moment where, I guess, what was his relationship to the aesthetics of the representation?
He edited the films, and we took multiple. I mean, I was literally clicking like that on the photography, and sometimes I bracketed one below and one above, and he chose between the different F's. I can't remember what it's called. Sorry. Anyway. He would have something to choose from, so he would edit from those different aspects of the camera and the film.
The aesthetic wasn't, though, to get the finest quality of photographic representation. It just wasn't going to enter into art.
It was to tell the story as simply as possible, with the best shots.
But you did great.
Yes,
You did good.
I know.
What's the second and maybe last?
So when I'm interested in when all of you talked about this idea of playing with conventions, I'm wondering to what extent, if at all, and Philip, you touched on it, but in what sense did these artists play with each other? I guess the stereotype of LA is that during that time was that it was nurturing, artists were curious, interested. Was provocation ever in the mix of how they related to each other? You know, I'm thinking of round about that time, but more north, various small fires, you know, the Ed Ruscha book,
Sure.
and then the photograph that Nauman took in his studio of burning that.
It wasn't north, it's right in LA.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
but
they
it
would
was-
have known. All of them would have known that word.
Was there any kind of interaction?
Well, that's
with
the
that?
show. The show is about that, and it's very spooky. Let me just explain one example, and I'm not even sure. There's this Chris Burden piece, the Death Valley Run, where he took the bike. So, okay. So after, in October 1976, like we talked this morning, and Mary Sue said in the summer of 1976, it was kind of obvious that Bas Jan Ader is not going to show up. Mm-hmm. And the artist would talk about that. And then Chris Burden did one of his most iconic pieces. I don't know if it's in the presentation. It is, so the bike, you know, and he would take this lightweight bike, the smallest lightweight bike, that's also what he wrote, referring here. You know, kind of referring to the smallest guppy that you can take to cross the Atlantic. And he would do this piece and crossing for 7 hours in the heat of it was, I think, 120 Death Valley. I mean, he was literally and metaphorically crossing Death Valley and to outrun death with the piece. And I think what's remarkable about it is, and I think he didn't even know that, but Bas Jan Ader's voyage on the sailboat was based on a trip that his dad took on his bike from the Netherlands to Palestine. And so there's things like that happen. Or there's Chris Burden talking, you know, on a kayak on the horizon in a piece called Solaris, and he would say, CB, Chris Burden to Houston, mission control. There's the astronaut. And so the astronaut pops up in Jack Goldstein's work. You see it there. And they're like threads that run through. I'm not really interested as an art historian to see, or to know who was first, because it's not about who was first, who
Yeah.
was second. It's more like about, they all bring a very different rhetoric and attitude, but there's like a core where they kind of share a similar interest or angle, and that's kind of remarkable. And when you go see the show, I really tried to have, it's like 3 mini retrospectives that are stuck together like a crystal, and I hope it shines.
One of the interesting parts of it, I think, is, for me anyway, is the element of the romanticism, and that they were literally all 3 of them involved in that, and were searching for the sublime, and were
Absolutely.
definitely not necessarily philosophical, but were consciously philosophical, but definitely philosophical in that sense.
That photograph mimicking Friedrich
Oh, Caspar David
right,
Friedrich.
right.
Caspar David.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to be just emblematic of what they all
Yeah.
were doing. I mean, it wasn't as dangerous, frightening, upsetting, but it has all of the poignancy as well as
And it's at the-
their view of them, I think their position in their own mind as artists.
What was his name again? What was
Caspar
the-
David Friedrich.
Oh, Friedrich.
Yeah, and it's at the very beginning of the show. But I think, thank you, we talked a lot, and I hope you can come back and see the show, and I would love to continue our conversation, but I want to thank you, Helene, and Mary Sue. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you had fun. Thank you.